My name is Allison Gilbert, and today I will be talking to you about environmental justice and ethical practices. Let's start with an introduction to environmental justice. Environmental justice is defined as a social movement that focuses on the fair treatment of all people regardless of their race, color, or income levels. It specifically looks at how these groups are treated in regards to environmental policy. Environmental justice focuses on involving all people in the development of environmental laws and policies. It also works to make sure that no group is disproportionately impacted in negative ways. The environmental justice movement began in the 1980s when people of color began challenging local companies on their construction and pollution. Toxic waste dumping and environmentally hazardous land use was disproportionately impacting low-income neighborhoods and communities primarily made up of minorities. This push went beyond the civil rights laws and environmental protections that were already in place. While there are many examples of environmental injustice, these two case studies get to the heart of the problem. First, between the 1980s and 1990s, North Carolina saw a boom in the production of hogs. This increase caused many farms to pop up in areas that used to house slave plantations. Today, residents in these areas still face economic hardship, poor health care, and limited educational opportunities. The odor caused by these farms, which smell like eggs and ammonia, are known to cause respiratory challenges and eye irritation to those who breathe in the toxic chemicals. This has led to claims of environmental racism and injustice. In addition, in Mexico, local residents began complaining in 1970 about the impact a U.S. factory was having on their environment. In 1990, a survey was finally conducted, and it was found that the river located next to the factory had 3,000 times more lead than the U.S. national standard. However, it wasn't until 1994, when the Federal Environmental Enforcement Agency stepped in, that the San Francisco factory owners were forced to pay fines and clean the river. The question of environmental justice really becomes, what can we do to achieve a more sustainable future that includes all individuals regardless of race, color, income, or background? Let's take a look at the ethical challenges associated with environmental injustice. According to the U.S. 2020 Census, in the United States, roughly 25% of the population are people of color. However, in neighborhoods located next to toxic release facilities, people of color make up about 56% of the population. This shows a disproportionate negative effect. The average income of people living within 3 miles of coal power plants is over $3,000 less than the national average, again showing a disproportionate negative impact on those living in poverty. And individuals living in poverty are exposed to 1.3 times the amount of toxic particulates as those living beyond poverty. For ethical ramifications, let's start with inequity. Programs such as the cap-and-trade mechanisms and other programs meant to lead to greater sustainability can negatively impact minorities and low-income populations who rely on cheap fossil fuels for heat and energy. For health, there is a national crisis in regards to those who are impacted by pollutants and toxic runoff. For opportunities, if sea levels rise and flood a community, low-income families do not have the resources to simply move. If the supply of fish runs out that is the main food source for an indigenous community, they do not have the chance to simply switch to a new food source. Climate change and natural resource depletion will cause major challenges to communities that already face disproportionate levels of inequity. And for threats, degradation of natural resources such as fish populations and crops will disproportionately impact minorities such as indigenous communities and low-income households that rely on the natural world for supplies. Without looking at environmental justice, we cannot create a more sustainable future, and we cannot move forward towards progress in terms of environmental management. Now let's look at the current policies surrounding environmental justice. Currently, there are a few different policies that tackle environmental justice. The first is the National Environmental Policy Act, which was created by the EPA and requires federal agencies to consider environmental justice in their activities. Next are the Clean Water and Clean Air Acts. These were created to address pollution concerns, public health issues, and set regulations for quality. We are going to look more closely at each of these. The National Environmental Policy Act requires the consideration of low-income, minority, and tribal populations. Organizations must determine if these groups are disproportionately affected in negative ways by health and environmental impacts. It takes into consideration cultural, social, and economic factors that can amplify environmental effects. Lastly, it requires meaningful community representation in all decision-making processes. Overall, the National Environmental Policy Act is considered a large step in the right direction for environmental justice. It works towards fair representation and treatment. However, there have been some challenges. The biggest challenge is that it currently takes almost a decade for a NEPA report to be developed. Due to this, many agencies are granted waivers, excusing them from the report. And lastly, it views the environment as stationary and rarely takes into account its change and its growth. The Clean Water Act implemented national standards for pollution control and water quality. However, there tends to be less enforcement of these standards in areas with large minority populations and low-income neighborhoods. Recently, in 2020, an update was made to the definition of waters and left roughly 50% of wetlands and 18% of streams unprotected. When looking at areas with high minority and tribal populations, the percent of unprotected streams is actually closer to 35%. There are many states currently working to appeal this ruling and to define waters in the United States in a way that takes environmental justice and climate change into account. The Clean Air Act sets limits for hazardous air pollutants and creates national standards for air quality. However, as the nation continues to fail air quality standards, the date required to achieve this keeps being pushed back. In a 2022 ruling by the Supreme Court, the EPA now has limited power in developing regulations for carbon emissions, a greenhouse gas that contributes greatly to climate change. Next, I'm going to talk about ethical approaches that could benefit environmental justice. We've looked at the challenges surrounding environmental injustice, but what can we do to change it? One solution is to focus on more ethical approaches to environmental management. I will be looking at 3 approaches: classical, utilitarianism, deontology, and postmodern ethics. In short, classical utilitarianism focuses on creating the greatest good for the greatest number. How can we do the most good for the largest number of people? It also focuses on the happiness of the community rather than individuals. This can positively impact environmental justice by bringing attention to local communities and their interests. It also combats the arguments of profit and self-interest by looking at the greater good. Deontology states that individuals should not lose liberties even when focusing on the greater good. It takes into consideration each individual's perspectives during decision-making processes. Having perspectives from locals, including minorities and other disproportionately impacted groups, will provide greater insight and support into environmental effects. Postmodern ethics considers all angles of a situation. It works to change unequal power relations. Bringing in local stakeholders, which includes impacted groups, can improve environmental justice. It puts the power back into the hands of these groups and includes culture, traditions, and beliefs. This is especially important to indigenous groups and those who practice traditional ecological knowledge. So what changes and improvements can be made? First, we should look at updating existing policies. Next, we should create new policies that more directly target environmental racism and injustice. And lastly, we need to be better about encouraging and enforcing these policies. Many current policies, such as the Clean Water and Clean Air Acts, are on the right track when it comes to environmental justice. However, they could be improved by more directly mentioning disproportionately impacted communities. Local community stakeholders should be part of these decision-making processes regarding these certain policies. There are many policies that could be created to combat environmental injustice. One of them is to focus on transportation. Air pollution, congestion, accidents, and more all lead to a decline in public health and often impact disadvantaged communities more frequently. Transportation also frequently receives waivers on the NEPA assessments. Creating more reliable public transportation, such as buses and trains that use green energy, is one way to combat this. The biggest challenge with current policies, according to the EPA, is that there are minimal resources available for enforcement. Unfortunately, this means that disadvantaged communities are often overlooked when it comes to checking on facilities and enforcing regulations. Increasing resources needed for enforcement would mean that agencies would be held to the standards set by the policies we have previously discussed. To wrap up my presentation, I want to share this quote. They say the environment is over here, the civil rights group is over there, the women's group is over there, and the other groups are here. Actually, all of them are one group, and the issues we fight become null and void if we have no clean water to drink, no clean air to breathe, and nothing to eat. Unless we work to combat environmental racism and injustice, we will never achieve a sustainable future. Thank you, and here are my references.